Ever since BMW's meteoric rise of the 70s and 80s, Alfa's target was to make a sporting saloon which could beat them. But in the 80s, we got used to a perennial cycle of disappointment every time they released a new car. The 33 was basically just a revamped Alfa Sud, which was already well past its sell-by date. The 75 was basically an odd-looking, scrunched-up Alfetta, and the Alfa 90, although charming in some ways and a good handling car, its quality and its ergonomics were well below par. And then with the 164, they made a brilliant car, and yet BMW still sold 6 times as many 5 Series. Let's find out why. And no, it's not really, as you might expect, about quality or rust. It came out in 1988 and it was born from a project in conjunction with Fiat, Lancia and Saab to make a 5 Series class family saloon. And for once, we really didn't need to make any excuses because it was a great car. And yet, even though they were cheaper than the 5 Series, they sold far fewer. Just 270,000 of these versus 1.3 million of the BMW. Even now, although they're much rarer, model for model, these are cheaper than an E34 BMW. So this one, for example, the Cloverleaf, which is the top of the range, well, the equivalent money-wise now would be a 525 E34, which is a great car, but it's just not really as special as this. Why? Well, it may sound counterintuitive, but for once, I don't think that quality was the main problem. It was more to do with the range of cars that they produced. First, a little bit of background. Now, Alfa went to great lengths to make this stand out from the other cars. So unlike those, it didn't even share the door pressings, and the Pininfarina styled body was sharp and handsome. It was also efficient through the air with a drag coefficient of just 0.3. It had a range of engines only used on this car, and even its own specific, more advanced front suspension. Quality took a step up, and it was the first Alfa that used galvanized steel panels all round to finally banish the fear of rust. It had the most complex electronics of any Alfa built up until this point. 3 ECUs, one that controlled the climate control, the other one for the engine, and one for the check panel and the instruments. In terms of ergonomics, it was actually pretty good as well. It's really comfortable, everything is at hand. The doors shut with a very un-Alfa thud. And the interior looks pretty nice. I'm not a massive fan of these identical switches all in a row there, but it's really not too bad. The seats are super comfortable as well. Handily, because it was front wheel drive, it also had more room in the back. The car I'm in today is the top of the range Cloverleaf. It's powered by the legendary 3-litre V6 Busso. I'd have one in a heartbeat. And yet, today I'm going to argue that this was part of the problem. I believe that part of the E34's success was down to its halo models. Whereas many competitors used mainly 4-cylinder engines, the BMW had 6s, 8s, and even the M cars. This helped to lift the image of the whole range so that buyers were then happy to pay a premium even for the more humdrum models like the 518 and the 520. Let's take it for a drive and I'll tell you more. It was offered with a series of engines. There was the 2-litre twin-cam twin-spark, which had a very competitive 155 horsepower. Then there was a turbo diesel 2.5, which had 125. And finally, of course, the incredible Busso. The first version came out as, I think, 190 horsepower in the normal 3-litre. Then the Cloverleaf had 200 horsepower. It was still the 8-valve version. Now that one, the very first car pre-facelift, really wasn't a very good thing. It was quite flawed, to say the least. So the chassis setup just wasn't ready for that engine. It suffered from torque steer, and the suspension was too hard. It was just lacking in traction and I think in development time. In 1993, they facelifted the cars and I think made them look way better just by making the front headlights a little bit thinner, a few other little touches. The interior was improved slightly as well, but crucially, the Cloverleaf then got the 24-valve version of this engine, which is 230 horsepower, but more importantly, they sorted the chassis. Time to take it through the gears, I think. Now, it's not blessed. It's not blessed with a huge amount of traction being front-wheel drive, and it's a little bit slimy today, so it will tend to wheel spin. There's still a little bit of torque still. They haven't completely eliminated it, and that engine always blows me away. Every single time I drive one of these, it's not so much the power, it's the way they develop it. It's the crispness with which, the enthusiasm with which it sort of goes up. And it's a really torquey engine as well, although it loves to fly up top. You know, at 2.5, 3,000, it responds instantly. It is a masterpiece for sure. There was also a four-wheel drive version of this called the Q4. I've never driven one, so I can't really comment on what it's like. Apart from the four-wheel drive system, the specs were pretty much the same as this car. The Cloverleaf got an upgraded suspension system, much more aggressive spoilers and skirts all round. And the suspension on this one, I don't think it was on the 8-valve, is an active system. So that means that you can switch it between automatic and sport. Andy, who owns this, warned me he couldn't tell the difference, and I have to say that when I've been toggling between the two, I don't think I can either. He said it just goes from hard to hard, and yeah, I pretty much agree with that. The suspension isn't that supple. It deals with the smaller stuff reasonably well, but you know, the car moves around a fair bit. You know you're in a stiff car. Luckily, the chassis also feels stiff, so it's not as bad as you might otherwise expect. The steering has got that lovely Alfa touch about it. I think they've got the speed just right, they've got the weighing right. It's enthusiastic enough, so it's got lightness to it, it's happy to turn in, but you're always aware that it's a front-wheel drive car, and that does detract a little bit, I think, from the experience, that you can't bring the back end into play so much. I think on a dry day with some grippier, newer tyres, I didn't have a look at these, so I'm not sure what they're like, but it doesn't feel like there's an amazing amount of grip there. I think it could be really good. As it is, it's a fun car. There's precision to the steering as well. It corners flatly, but yeah, it isn't up to scratch if you compare it to the equivalent BMW. Having said that though, I don't think that's the reason why it didn't do as well as it could have. That 9th or 10th degree of extra polish that the BMW has, most people wouldn't really drive a car as hard as to notice. One of the things I think that really affected this was its positioning. As I mentioned, the Halo models just weren't complete enough. And they weren't good enough, they didn't have enough power. I mean, the M5 version of the E34 had 340 horsepower, so a full over 100 horsepower more than this. It also cost a huge amount more. So really, to be fair, you'd have to compare this to a 530. In terms of prices, that probably would have still been more expensive. But you're sort of getting there, and performance is quite similar too. So it has the ignominy of being traded down and compared to a lesser car than the one that was at the peak of the BMW range. But then that 530, although maybe not as fun as this, would have been a more accomplished car as well. Now, they did improve quality drastically on these, and this car with 140,000 miles has really fared pretty well. All the door cards, which by the way, I love that sort of stitched leather with the little stripes on the side. But anyway, the door cards are good. They've survived really well. All the instrumentation is fine as well. The switches haven't worn particularly. If there's one thing, then it's the top of the instrument binnacle where the leather, that's just sun damage really, has lifted. But apart from that, it looks great. Still though, I have to admit, it's not at BMW levels, because you do get the odd creak and rattle that would simply be absent from an E34, but it's more than acceptable. Nowadays, it makes an interesting alternative, and many of the disadvantages that were there when the cars were new, as classic, just aren't as much of an issue. As much as I like the Cloverleaf, it's actually the 2-litre, I think, that makes a better case for itself against its competition. The twin cam was the last use, the last development of that iconic Alfa engine. It had twin spark, but it also had variable valve timing, and this is before Honda came up with the VTEC. And my dad had one, so I was able to drive it when I was sort of 18, 19, 20. And I remember, it's a very go-karty feeling little car. And because you have less weight at the front, there's a little bit more precision in this. There's a tiny bit of torque steer, but there's less torque steer as well. I really think as a competitor, it should have done better. And I'm convinced that the fact that the top of the range cars were a little bit more lacking in polish is what really impacted on the overall sales of the 164. Even the standard sort of 3-litre Busso engine that wasn't the Cloverleaf, so it had more supple suspension, it was still a little bit lacking in finesse. As a front driver, it can't really hope to match the dynamics of the German cars, but you know, it is good fun to thread through these bends. You just have to adapt your driving style. The gear change is a little bit lumpy, but the BMW one isn't really much better. If you want to see how one of the rear-wheel drive Alphas compared to this, I'll put a link to my 75 video review here. Do take a look at that. Thank you so much to Andy for coming down with this, and thanks to all of you for watching.